Even if you have a black thumb and you can barely keep a houseplant alive, you're going to leave this video with the basic skills to keep these 5 plants thriving in your home. Hey, Lee here, and when we can't take care of a houseplant, it's usually because of our lack of understanding of how sun, soil, and water interact with that specific plant. When we get a new plant, if we have a better understanding of those 3 things, our chances of survival go way up. I'll share each plant, give you a general time frame of when the next time you should be checking in on those plants are, and I'll teach you the things that you should be looking for that might need you to water your plant more frequently or less frequently. The first plant, everyone's favorite, the Pothos. Inexpensive, available everywhere, hanging, climbing, vining, the Pothos. You can think about checking in on this plant once every 7 days. You may need to water your plant less frequently if you put this plant somewhere where it's not getting lots of light. The Pothos is often labeled as a low light plant. This will cause the plant to grow slower, smaller, and produce less energy. With less energy, this plant absorbs water much slower, which means that the soil will stay wet for longer. And if you're just using a generic potting soil for this plant, it will stay wetter for longer, which means that you need to water it even less frequently. Make sure that this plant is able to go through a wet and dry cycle, so you don't want to water it again until the soil is almost dry. With these 2 factors, you may even have a plant that you need to water once every 2 weeks. Blanket statements like water this every 7 days don't really work, especially if we're not taking account how the light and soil may be affecting how often you need to water your plant. You may need to water your plant more frequently than once every 7 days if this is getting a lot of light. This plant does love lots of bright light, and as long as it's not getting several hours of direct sunlight right up against a window, it should be fine. More light means the soil will dry out faster, which means that you'll have to water it more frequently. And if your soil is really well draining, for example, if you added lots of perlite to your soil, your plant will hold less moisture, and that means you have to water your plant again more frequently. The large Pothos in my collection, I water that once every 8 days. This smaller one, I water once every 4 or 5 days. We also have to consider the size of our plant. Big plants dry out a lot slower than smaller plants, and we need to consider the type of material that the plant is sitting in. Terracotta pots dry out faster when compared to plastic pots. You can stick your finger in the soil or use a pencil or wooden dowel to see how wet or dry the soil is. Remember, we want this plant to mostly dry out before we water it again. Our job is to try to listen to what plants want and be consistent with our care. Thankfully, the Pothos is a very forgiving plant, as well as the other plants on this list. Another easy houseplant to keep alive is this mini Monstera, or the Raphidaphora Tetrasperma. It's a great looking houseplant that has a really cool leaf shape and will also develop fenestrations if you're doing a great job taking care of it. This plant will need something to climb up to get bigger and develop more fenestrations. Once hard to find, you should be able to find this plant at many garden centers for about $20 or less. And you can think about checking in on this plant once every 7 days. You may need to water this plant less frequently if you're giving it less light. This plant really thrives in bright light and will do really well close to a window. The less light it gets, you'll see smaller leaves and it may even lose its fenestrations. If your soil is heavy with potting mix, you'll have to water it less frequently again. But this plant really does thrive in a well-draining soil mix, so I would recommend at the very least make sure that you're mixing in a lot of perlite with your typical potting soil if you need to repot this plant. I water my plant fairly frequently, about once every 5 days. It gets a lot of filtered morning light and indirect light from a south-facing window. As I said, this plant really does need a great potting mix. I recommend orchid bark, perlite, horticultural charcoal mixed with a little bit of potting soil. I do have a video on how to make this soil, and I'll include that link down in the description. And as always, consistency is key. Check to see if the soil is nearly dry before watering again. And of course, you can't have this list without the snake plant. This thing can take so much abuse, and it's great for beginners if you know to be checking in on this plant about once every 3 weeks. Sometimes it's better to think of a snake plant in the same terms as a cactus when it comes to watering. Watering too frequently will cause this plant to suffer. Water this plant less frequently if you have it in low light. It can be a great low light plant, but don't expect it to grow any new leaves or get any bigger. If you have this plant in low light, it is possible to water this once every 4 weeks to have the plant just stay the way it is. When you have this plant in higher light, it will grow much faster. Train your plant slowly to take more light over time. You could even have it in direct sunlight if you're patient. Just keep an eye out for sunburnt leaves. With this plant in high light, you may even need to water it once every 2 weeks or even once a week. With this plant, it's important to have a good mix that doesn't hold a lot of water. You could consider 1 part perlite, 1 part cactus soil, and 1 part potting soil. You could also experiment with materials like coco coir, and affiliate links will be down in the description below if you want to check out those products yourself. A ZZ plant is another plant that's easy to keep alive, but only if you're ignoring it. Similar to the snake plant, this gets labeled as a low light plant. This plant can survive in low light, but it won't grow very fast. The key to this plant is to ignore it. You can start checking in on this plant once every 3 weeks. I water my plant even less frequently because I keep mine in such low light. I water it about once a month, and its leaves are still healthy and it does produce new growth, just not very frequently. If your plant is getting less light and your soil drains really well, you might even need to water your plant once every 4 weeks as well. If your plant is getting much higher light and you're using a great mix of mostly cactus, soil, and perlite, you may be watering your plant even once every 2 weeks. But this plant does like to dry out completely, so make sure that you're sticking your wooden dowel all the way to the bottom of the plant and make sure that it's completely dried out before you water it again. And another quick tip with this plant is make sure that you're not repotting or separating this plant until it's breaking out of its pot. This plant absolutely loves to be root bound, so make sure that you're ignoring the plant. This next plant that I'm constantly misidentifying as either a bryophyllum or a kalanchoe is this guy. I think it's a mother of thousands. I have no idea. This plant is a succulent, so it does need to have direct sunlight for several hours a day. It also needs a great potting soil mix, so think about cactus soil mixed with perlite or some other amendment. This plant is great because it produces pups on the end of its leaves. When they fall off, they root in soil, and it's really easy to propagate. I water my plant about once every 3 weeks, and I'm making sure that it's dried out completely before I water it again. Since this plant is so easy to propagate, I have to add it to this list. If you have a window that gets several hours of direct sunlight a day, this is the plant for you. Leave your recommendations for other easy houseplants in the comments. Like the video if it was helpful, and consider subscribing. See you next time.